Can everyone hear me all right? Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for attending this conference. And if that's okay with you, we will now proceed in English.
Everyone, and thank you very much for joining us in what promises to be a very engaging conversation on the future of the regional order. Before we start discussing this issue of the future of the Middle East, let me just briefly explain why we pick up this topic. If you follow Middle East news, as we do, you may have noticed, maybe over the past 2 years, that every week brings breaking news, a headline, and basically there are so many changes and shifts taking place in so many places at the same time. So this makes it almost impossible for us to try to make sense of the regional order or to try to have the full picture of the Middle East. In less than 2 years, we have witnessed the deadliest attack against Israel in its history. We've seen a genocide in Gaza. We've seen war, strikes, bombings in Lebanon, in Syria, and we have even witnessed the first direct confrontation ever between Israel and Iran. So over this short period, actually, the Middle East has shifted in ways that appear to be irreversible. Think, for instance, of where we were on October the 7th. Israel looked very vulnerable on October the 7th, 2023. Of course, Israel looked vulnerable. Iran and the resistance axis were very confident that this was the end of Israel as we knew it in the region. And some even predicted the end of the Abraham Accords. Today, 2 years later, the picture is completely different. Israel has emerged as a military hegemon. It claims it has restored its deterrence. Iran and the resistance axis are at their lowest point. And on the top of that, we have some other ongoing changes, such as the fall of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, which is opening the door to other dynamics. On the other hand, we have seen also across these 2 years that some predictions proved wrong. The reconciliation between Iran and Saudi Arabia, as well as the Abraham Accord, seem to have resisted to these 2 years of war. And finally, against all the predictions of the US withdrawing from the Middle East, what we see today is that Washington is more present than ever in Gaza, in Israel, in Yemen, and of course also in Iran. So how do we make sense of all these ongoing changes? What are their implications for the regional order? And are we heading towards more escalation or de-escalation? To dig into these questions, we have today 3 outstanding experts. Let me start on my left. Bader Al-Saif is a historian of modern and contemporary Middle East and Islamic thought. He holds a PhD from Georgetown University. Dr. Al-Saif is also the founding President of Al-Saif Consulting, an assistant professor of history at Kuwait University, and a fellow at both Chatham House and the Arab Gulf State Institute. Al-Saif has served as Deputy Chief of Staff to a former Kuwaiti Prime Minister, Senior Vice President of the oil and gas sector at Al-Jariri, and a senior public policy consultant. At my left, we also have Intissar Fakir, who is senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, based in Washington, D.C. Intissar is a foreign policy expert specializing in North Africa and the Sahel, focusing on governance, security, and regional stability. She advises US and European governments on Mediterranean dynamics and serves on advisory boards for the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime and Diplomats. Intissar participates in strategic working groups on the Mediterranean security and governance and provides strategic counsel to private sector clients on political risk. Her expertise spans conflict prevention, North African politics and foreign policy, Sahel security, energy and food security. Her writing and analysis appears in international media. Finally, on my right, we have Fatima Moussaoui, who holds a PhD in international security from the Instituto Universitario General Gutiérrez Mellado. Fatima graduated from Sciences Po Paris, War College of Paris, and the Naval School of Brest. Dr. Moussaoui is a lecturer and mentor at the Sciences Po Paris School of Public Affairs, the Department of Security and Defense, and affiliated to the Conservatoire National des Arts et Métiers in Paris. Fatima also acts as policy advisor to institutions and companies seeking expertise on the Middle East. And Dr. Fatima has over 15 years of experience in the MENA media sector as a journalist and producer of documentary films. So thank you all again. Thank you very much for being here with us. I suggest that we split this conversation into two parts. On one hand, we would take stock of the developments that had happened over the region, and then we will reflect on the possible futures of order in the Middle East. So Bader, my first question goes to you. We've said that regional conflict has become a reality over the past 2 years. We've had war in Gaza, in the West Bank, Lebanon, Yemen, Iran, and Syria. And more recently, there were the bombings in Doha that sent shockwaves across Gulf countries. And many actually states from the Gulf questioned Washington's role as a protector of these countries. So what is your view on these latest regional developments, and how do Gulf countries perceive these ongoing developments?
I mean, look, first of all, I'm very happy to be in your company, and I look forward to an engaging discussion. The Gulf states are part of a larger ecosystem, which is the Middle East and obviously the larger global stage. And I think we need to put into context the events of the last 2 years into how the regional order is shaping up. Because if we understand how the Gulf sees it, we can probably understand then the implications of that and how they can play a role in either supporting, the resolutions forward. And there has been quite some discussion out there about us moving into a multipolar world in which different parties are playing different roles, and that has been manifesting in the past few years. And what I'd like to argue is I think we've jumped too quick into this multipolar bandwagon. I think we're not there yet. I think what we have is a fragmented world order on the one hand, and I think on the second, we have various world orders competing with one another. And that competition is then spilling over into sometimes conflicts and sometimes collaborations. And then I'll end with a third argument on where the Gulf sits in all of this. So I just wanted to put it into context first. And why do I say we live in a fragmented world? I mean, you said weekly breaking news. I wish it was weekly. It's becoming daily, unfortunately. And these breaking news have become negative news that are catastrophic, and it starts with human security being compromised. And at the top of the list in this human security element is obviously the Palestine-Israel conflict. This has been a conflict that we've been living in the region for decades, and it's a conflict that has only heightened in the last 2 years to become a live-streamed genocide in which we have the highest now orphanage in modern history, we have the largest number of maimed children, and we have unaccounted for deaths. I mean, the numbers that you see are just a fraction, I think, of what we will discover in the coming days, weeks, and months. Now, this fragmentation within Israel-Palestine, unfortunately, hits every corner in the world. So we're talking about a civil war, a very bloody one in Sudan. We're talking about conflicts between Pakistan and Afghanistan, between Cambodia and Thailand. We're talking about conflicts in Russia and Ukraine. And now you're seeing a US aircraft carrier, as we speak, moving closer to Venezuelan shores. So battlefields are becoming globalized, unfortunately, and that's quite worrying for how our global system is heading. And I think, moving to my second point on where we stand when it comes to the world that we're living in, people have soon retired the US in claiming that the unipolar moment is over. And as you said, Moussa, I mean, the US is very present in the Gulf region and in the Middle East. I wouldn't square it off and push it aside. I mean, we have the biggest military from the US. We have a huge cultural component coming from the US up to this date. Look at the enrollment of international students in universities. Look at how the culture in the US is manifesting itself. So I wouldn't square off the US quite a bunch. So the unipolar moment is weakening from the 90s, but it's still around. Now, if I pick up on Mr. Trump's own language when he met the Chinese premier just 10 days ago, he called the two countries the G2. And here he was signaling as if we have a bipolar world in which China and the US are now the two great hegemons. Certainly, this is the way that many interpreted Mr. Trump's statement. And the numbers speak to that. So the US, to reinforce its standing, contributes the highest number to world GDP. We're talking about 26% coming from the US alone. And who's next? China with 18% of the global GDP. But the question is, if we were to push that bipolar world order, will the Chinese go beyond the economy and play a military role? That's a big question. And we've seen some fiddlings with the Chinese in our region, at least, with the brokering of the with the Iran-Saudi deal. But it's yet not to be moving forward. Multipolar world, I think a lot of buzz. And you see certainly the Chinese, for example, pushing the Asian Development Bank. You have Bretton Woods institutes being undermined by such a development. You have the BRICS, 11 member states. But you know what's missing, Moussa, in the multipolar moment is there are no governance structures that guide them. What are the rules and regulations that will guide these countries? And let me give you a small example. The OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, is a conglomerate of 57 member states, and they are close to 8% of the global GDP, and they have over 2 billion citizens in those conglomerates. But when, for example, when the Doha attack happened a few months ago, or before that, when Israel continued pounding on Gaza, they meet, they convene, all we end up with is declarations. There is no action. So we cannot really count a multipolar world when that is moving forward. Now, that takes me to the final point, and I'll come closer to the Gulf and to your direct question. How do we see the world from the Gulf? And obviously the Gulf is 6 different states, and within each state you have different constituencies and interests. So it's not necessarily that there is one voice, and we can get into that further in the Q&A. But I like to argue that we're pushing for an apolar world, a world in which polarity is not central. Why should we stick to a certain pole when we move forward? I think these are young countries that have now become their own powerhouse in their own might. They are decentering the nation state. They're looking at regional connectivities. They're thinking of digitality. They're thinking of how they can absorb the newness that comes out in tech and AI. And they will also, if you look at how they operate, they're quite pragmatic, nimble, fluid. So they try to play with the different actors on the ground. And this is the spirit that we would like to see the region move forward with. Now, it's unfortunate that the main block to moving the country forward today is Israel. We understand that Israel was attacked, and we condemn this attack. No innocent soul should be forsaken. But we don't respond to an attack with a worse attack. And I think the situation has been in which the Gulf states, the MENA states have been pushing for a 2-state solution ever since the 2002 Beirut summit, yet they have not seen any reciprocal action on that peace element from the Israelis. The one exception was the Oslo agreement that came out in the 90s. And let me tell you, after Oslo happened, the biggest settlement activity also happened in the West Bank. So this does not bode well. I think we need to imagine a new world, and it will only take us doing that by retiring old concepts and imagining it with a new concept like the apolar moment.
Thank you so much, Bader. It's actually a very nice way to start the conversation. Now let me turn to Intissar. Bader was already mentioning it. Another ongoing debate around the future of the Middle Eastern, the regional order in the Middle East has to do with the role of Washington. And actually, until 2023, there was this idea that the US is withdrawing from the Middle East to pivot to Asia. That was well before, but we've seen Washington playing a key role in terms of military and diplomatic support to Israel. It has intervened militarily in Yemen, also in Iran, and of course we have seen Trump coming up with what he calls a peace plan for Gaza. So does that mean that a sort of Pax Americana still prevails in the Middle East? And what is Trump's vision of and for the Middle East?
Thank you. Let me just kind of start with a little bit of a, I guess maybe a bit of an anecdote. It's true that every single administration wants to do less in the Middle East, and every single one of them ends up doing more in the Middle East. And that kind of explains the degree of engagement that you are talking about. Let me just kind of say a couple of things that Bader has already alluded to. I think the US remains important in a number of different areas. Militarily, of course, we saw that. A recent reminder with the 12-day war in June, of course, the security guarantees to Qatar. It remains important in terms of AI, in terms of chips, in terms of technology innovation. That's an area where the US plays a huge role. And the US's diplomatic support still matters. It's something that is still important, and it speaks to the US's capabilities. But I would argue that what we are seeing is a lot of engagement, a lot of power, but not a lot of control over events. And what I mean by control is the ability to shape outcomes, the ability to shape regional order, the ability to avoid escalation and essentially prevent instability and wars that you don't want to see as a big actor. So my answer to your question is that no, these elements point to not a Pax Americana moment. And I think it's important to understand when we talk about a Pax Americana moment and why it's not a Pax Americana moment, to sort of think about what prevails, which is the question of capability, is the question of power, and what is being lost, which is the question of control. Now, I want to make it very clear that I'm not talking about sort of a sudden disruption and kind of end of control. We are talking about a gradual erosion of control, and the question of Pax Americana has been there, I think, particularly something that was debated in the aftermath of the Iraq War and so on, and remains. But I think it's kind of important to understand that we have seen consecutive US administrations really struggle to shape regional order, and I think the Trump administration is another example of that. And let me just kind of look at a couple of examples of Trump administration engagement in the Middle East and sort of explain to you what I mean by a loss of overall control. So if we start with, kind of look more broadly at the Trump administration record, I would say that the record is at best mixed. And if you kind of highlight some of what you have, and I think others have sort of identified as successes, we can go through them and kind of say. So let's talk first about the Gaza ceasefire. The Gaza ceasefire is limited. Let's maybe start with what it has done well. It has ushered in the release of hostages, Israeli hostages. That's been a success. It has halted large-scale fighting. That's also been a success. But it is a very fragile peace, and we have seen a number of times in which it has been a ceasefire, I should say, not peace. It's been a very fragile ceasefire, and we've seen a number of times in which it has been disrupted. Some other key elements of it, which have to do with aid delivery to kind of wide-scale aid delivery to Gaza, that remains an issue. The delivery has been patchy. The volume has been not what it is. And of course, you have parts of northern Gaza that are still in need of aid. If you look at the US strike on Iranian nuclear facilities, and I think you mentioned yourself, and maybe Bader mentioned this is something that would have completely destabilized and changed the regional order in 2010. And if you consider it now, yes, there's been, Iran has been weakened, but it's not defeated. And overall, I think when it comes to nuclear capabilities, we are still sort of trying to understand what the actual impact is. And, it seems that maybe some indication is that it was minimal. So I would say that the US administration has not managed to, let's say, kind of, move these strikes and kind of parlay these strikes into a bigger change in Iran or even a bigger change in the region. So again, here I see power, I see capability, but I don't see a lot of control. And then, of course, you have the Qatar strike, which I would argue is, the biggest kind of example that undermines the concept of Pax Americana. You have Israel attacking a U.S. ally with a large U.S. Military base in the Middle East. And of course that, what sort of message does that send is that, what does it mean to be an ally of the U.S.? Does it hold any guarantees? Does it hold any kind of restrictions? Of course, there were guarantees that were offered, etc. But the fact that happened is itself a big indication of the sort of limits, let's say, of Pax Americana. So I would argue that there are a lot of elements that are missing in order for this to actually be a true Pax Americana moment. You have essentially a lack of control, meaning there's sort of limited ability to avoid escalation, as I mentioned earlier, and to lessen volatility. You have a lack of clear strategic framework, which is something that I think Bader was kind of intuiting a little bit with kind of the way that we see this apolarity playing out. The Trump administration has a very strong sort of transactionalist preferred mode, but transactionalism is an approach. It can be effective in certain instances, but it is not an overall strategy. And then, of course, you have at the same time regional partners kind of, showing more agency, acting sort of more independently and exerting, let's say, their own will and influence in ways that they determine is important for them nationally, and in a way that allows them to shape their immediate region. And then, of course, I would say the last maybe aspect that fits into this is U.S. domestic vulnerabilities. You have a lot of divisions. You have weakening of state institutions, and you have sort of a very, let's say, personality-driven policy-making process that really affects. And I would say that cumulatively, all of these factors impact the U.S.'s ability to project power. Let me just say it's always a more interesting panel when your panelists disagree. So I kind of disagree a little bit on the vision of sort of this kind of Pax Americana, but I think it's worth sort of analyzing and even debating and discussing. What are the limits of that?
Thank you very much, Intissar. Let me turn now to Fatima. Intissar was just mentioning that Iran has not been defeated. But actually, one of the major issues that is being discussed within the framework of all these discussions on the future of the regional order has to do with the weakening of the axis of resistance today. So we can argue whether Iran has been defeated or not, but Hamas and Hezbollah have been weakened, at least. We can say the same with regards to Iran, which suffered considerable damage. Meanwhile, the Bashar al-Assad regime collapsed, so we have another key piece of the axis of resistance that has somehow collapsed. So my question is, what are the consequences of all these developments for Iran? And more importantly, what do you think about this debate of whether Iran is going to rebuild its network, its axis of resistance or not?
So for the consequences on Iran is like, being weak, seeing that is a weak state, because the belt, the strategic, the security and strategic belt that they construct, the axis of resistance. So, they built it, they made decades to build these partners, these proxies, and now they are without this weapon, to retard any offensive. And from inside as well, with all the destruction of the nuclear sites. So Iran is weak, but Iran was weak before. But we with the political narrative, we see it Iran as a very strong state and is not And this statement, I made it before, that as for realpolitik, on realpolitik, Iranian state is a weak state because this state is in an embargo since decades. Economically, they are collapsed from inside. The people are suffering from inside. They invest in weapon industry, missiles and drones. But if you compare to the, to the industry of weapon, you cannot. It's not the same level. They succeed to make, to empower, how do you say, the neglected communities in all the Arab, not all Arab countries, but some Arab countries like Iraq, like Syria, like Lebanon, Yemen. So now I think Iran don't have too much options, and I see it like waiting, because their strategy is more patience. They how do you say? They are more opportunistic. They how do you say? The mindset of Iranian regime is more opportunist, by jumping on opportunities to capitalize on the situation on the ground. So, for example, for the Qatar attacks, the offensive on Qatar is like a golden gift to Iran to come up and to build a new political narrative and to say, yeah, I was right. So, and Tehran can say to their neighborhood that it was right. All what they did, it was right. So, Iran is more a country, is based on ideology constructed by a meaning that, here from Western point of view, we don't understand this country because we don't know really the history of this country and how they built a system, and they are closed. At the same time, I can say that the real problem of Iran now is their youth, and they are, how do you say, from 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini, when he arrived to power, and he succeeded to put the Shah of Iran out the power. He chosen United States as the enemy to keep the light of the revolution, and he chose United States because it's a powerful country, and to keep his sacredness alive. And they want to export this idea of their Islamic State to the other countries around, to the Sunni country. And but they didn't succeed because the war with Iraq stopped this project. They invited Yasser Arafat to Tehran. They helped the Palestinians to fight. But at the same time, all the project that they make in place, it wasn't, for me, from my understanding and my field work, it was like a political narrative, and it wasn't really, really a name to go forward. So it was a strategy to recruit on popular basis, an Arab popular basis, and to create a kind of a community to be following Ayatollah Khomeini. And from that, after the end of Iraq war, they could create a kind of axis of resistance. This is the partner and the proxies, because Ansarullah in Yemen are not really a proxy. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Hashd al-Sha'bi in Iraq. So they succeeded to create this because they couldn't export their model. So what I see, all this project that they invest in, is weakened, but didn't disappear completely. And I think now it's a question of time. Iran is more busy with internal affairs, and the option for Iran is the nuclear program, not other options, because working on empowerment, doing empowerment for the militia, for the armed group, for the popular base, because there is differences between when I said militia, when I said the armed group, and when I said the popular base. All are connected, and this is decade and decade of work. It's not from a day to another. It's not 1 year. It's decades of work. It's investments. And there is a strategy that is made in place to put this axis of resistance. They put it in place. So I think that they don't have many options. The only option they have is a nuclear program. And but from my understanding, the Iranians, they are ready to fight. Is their lifestyle, you know, the revolution, the idea of the revolution, the idea of the Wilayat al-Faqih, this kind of thing, they are not, it's not something strange for them. The population are, you know, prepared to this. The danger for them, I see it from inside, and I see it with the change of the generation and the youth. Because the youth, they want something different. Some of them are more influenced by the Western view, by our models. Some of them, they don't see where to position themselves, and they want their own identity. They are really nationalists. So they're still looking for where to position themselves. So I think the real danger for them is not a question for war or to go for war, because I believe that we will go for war. It will happen, another war. But is more from inside, and the people, how they are seeing their own governments.
Thank you very much, Fatima. This is what you're saying is actually pretty interesting, because it seems that there is this debate of whether Iran would become the Iran we knew in the early 90s after the war with Iraq, meaning a country that was weak but started to rebuild its capacities, that worked with Hezbollah and other proxies, or if Iran would become the Iraq from the early 90s, facing isolation, embargo, and leading to a change of regime. So you've mentioned the nuclear issue, and now maybe we're moving into the second part of this discussion. It seems that one of the key parameters for stability in the region has to do with the nuclear issue, and it sounded like you were saying Iran is going to keep with its own nuclear enrichment program. So what possible scenarios do you see for Iran in the coming months and years? You've talked about another round of war. I would like to hear more about it. I guess you're talking about a new war with Israel. So do you see isolation? Do you see a rapprochement between Iran and other countries? I remember, and actually I think, Bader, you've mentioned that in your social network, you you participated in the Manama dialogue, and there was this statement from the Omani Ministry of Foreign Affairs saying that Israel and not Iran is the main threat to stability. So within this context, basically, what immediate future do you see for Iran in the region?
I think Iran will not let down their partners. Iran, when they decide to engage with a country, with a group, with people, they will not let them down. This is a rule for them, for their mindset, how they think, their doctrine, their military doctrine. Now, but they can do nothing right now for them, for their partners. Their partners, they will remodel their system, how to work, how to think, how to engage. They will do it by themselves. Every group, every partners will be linked to his own regional dynamic and reality. Everyone, he will model his own way to deal. Iran, I see it with, yes, as you said, for Iran-Iraq war was, it's really important what's happened during these 8 years for Iran. They understood that they found themselves very alone with no partner, no ally, nobody helped them. So they invest at this time when they finish with the war, they invest in military industry. What we see now as a drone, missiles, they started from that, from the end of the 1988, the end of the 80s. So they started from that. So we are seeing the result of this year's decades. And the axis of resistance is the result as well, the decision that they made from this date. And the nuclear program, you know, Khomeini, when he arrived to power in 1979, he canceled the nuclear program. He said, he made a fatwa, and he said, we will not use this, we will not continue what the Shah did with, because the nuclear program was started with the Shah in 1950 with the cooperation of United States. So Khomeini, when he arrived, he said, no, we will not continue in this way because this weapon, we will not use it because our religion will not allow us to do this. So the experience of war with Iraq show them that they cannot protect themselves, and for their national security, he reactivate the program, nuclear program, at the end of the Iran-Iraq war. And another information that I can give to you, that during these years, the only country who helped Iran is Israel. Iran Gate is really famous, so they gave them weapons. So the thing is, they understood a lot of things from this experience. They understood they cannot export their Islamic model to the other countries for different reasons. They cannot, it's impossible. Even now is more impossible, you know, that they export their model because they are minority in a minority of Shia. They are different from the majority Shia of Iraq. And during Iran-Iraq war, Khomeini discovered that the Shia of Iraq, he was thinking during the war that the Shia of Iraq will stand up with him, but they stand up with Saddam Hussein. So it was like a big discovery, and because the Iraqi are really nationalists, so they didn't accept to go, they stand up with Saddam Hussein. So they understood they cannot export their model, it's impossible. They understood that they cannot have any partners really to help them if there is a war, and they should build their own industry. And the nuclear program, they reactivate the nuclear program as deterrence weapon. So this is a really important fact that we should have it on mind. So now I think with all what's happened with the, and I should say something else as well, the war between Israel and Iran, from Iranian perception, Israel was never chosen as an enemy to fight or to put down. It was, they used the narrative of the Palestinian issue to recruit the Arabic popular base, because they know that the Arabs are really emotional, passionate. So this is a strategy, political strategy. So when we see the narrative, the political narrative, the level is not, actually they say things, but their action is less in reality. And we saw it, you know, what's happened the two last years. So the idea is they support, they empower groups, they support them, they are sincere in this action, but their interest is first. So this is the strategy of moving on the region. So to answer your question about the nuclear program, I think they have no other options than the nuclear weapon, it will have like a weapon for deterrence. And I don't see another option for them. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, you are giving us bad news for the upcoming month.
The thing is, for the war, how I see it actually, I can say something else that usually the people, when I discussed this topic, they were really surprised. And I said, before the October 7th, I was always saying that one day the Iranians and Israel, Iran and Israel will sign a comprehensive agreement. And everyone was looking to me like, are you crazy? You know, there is a shadow war. And I said, yes, but there is a lot of similitude in the way that because both countries, they are fighting to exist. And somehow, they are fighting to exist. And I don't see it very strange. But now, after the 7th of October, I can say it that the war, the coming war, I think, it will lead to this comprehensive agreement, and it will be. And this war, I think this war is not a war of Israel, it's a war of United States, because it's making a new order in all the region. For me, it's a war between Iran and United States.
No, that's an interesting take. I personally see it as a war between two countries that pretend to be the regional leader.
No.
This is my view. We can discuss this further, but as a moderator, I cannot engage within this discussion. But you were talking about the role played by Washington, and I wanted to go back to you, Intissar. One of the biggest challenges in predicting changes in the Middle East is that Trump himself is a wild card. A wild card precisely because he's unpredictable. We were mentioning it before. Trump visited the Gulf countries with all these series of mega deals in May. He talked about a Middle East defined by commerce, not chaos. Yet 1 month later, Washington was bombing Tehran. So what role do you see for Washington in the coming years? Do you have any prospect you would like to share? You've been talking about the Trump plan for Gaza, but do you see any prospect for U.S. role in the upcoming month and years?
So before I talk about Trump's priorities and kind of U.S., the future of U.S. engagement in the Middle East, let me just say very quickly on Israel and sort of to me, the actions of Israel and the relationship between Israel and the U.S. is a really interesting example of what I was talking about, not to belabor the point, of a lot of capability, a lot of power, but not a lot of control. So you have Israel fighting, multi-front wars in the Middle East, and you have the U.S. essentially adjusting to sort of kind of accommodate, let's say, or to respond to Israeli action. The cooperation, the engagement is not even based on principles of engagement, or cooperation, I should say. You really have kind of Israel, in a way, doing what it wants to do, and the U.S. kind of sort of adjusting. So again, to me, that to the point where you have Israeli security aims expanding so much in the region that it actually becomes, it is perceived as the main threat, not Iran, as you mentioned yourself. That to me does not speak of de-escalation. That to me does not speak of the ability to shape regional order on the part of the U.S. So I just wanted to make that point, because I kind of felt like that maybe that was kind of another way of looking at it and another way of reading it. Now, in terms of U.S. priorities in the Middle East, I think what we have to judge by is what Mr. Trump and President Trump has been doing in the region. And as you've said it yourself, this is about deals, this is about transactions, and this is more crucially about transactions that can be sold domestically as political wins, primarily, and to a lesser extent that can tick sort of the America First box. Yeah, if you look at a lot of the deals that have been made, they don't always neatly fit in that America First kind of box. But I would argue that these are the two sort of the two kind of main indications that we have. So what we have is a U.S. policy that is not animated by a strategy. It is purely animated by this sort of opportunistic, let's say, engagement that is very much defined by what the administration, but what President Trump himself sees as a potential for making a deal. And I would say, sometimes this approach works. Sometimes this approach works because it creates bigger chances for resolving, intractable issues. Because it essentially narrows it down to a very narrow issue. When you take a conflict and you make it about a deal, then it becomes a little bit easier to resolve. But of course, it has its drawbacks. It creates unpredictability, as you mentioned. And the opportunities are, again, defined very much by what one person or let's say sort of a select group of people see as kind of personal kind of preference rather than, what is, let's say, a national strategy. Now, I want to be very clear here. I'm not saying transactionalism is a bad way of conducting policy. We have, conducted foreign policy based on strategy that has backfired, of course, but I'm saying it's important to understand its limitations and its drawbacks so that we understand what we are doing. And I think in a way what we are doing is that we are trading in flexibility that comes with a very sort of narrow transactionalist approach for a durable kind of influence that you trade in when you sit at the table and sort of negotiate for a very narrow particular deal. So what does this mean in terms of the outlook for U.S. engagement? I think it's going to, we're going to continue to see the U.S. engaged at the same level in the Middle East. It's been historically difficult to curtail U.S. engagement in the Middle East. That's what I started by saying at the outset. And I think unless there is a very big shift, whether we are talking about potentially a fundamental change in U.S. Security posture, I don't know, maybe a war with Venezuela, whatever the future brings, I think we will probably continue to see the same level of engagement. Potentially even more if there is any sort of big role for the U.S. in a Gaza reconstruction future. But again, we are talking about the same sort of engagement without control, and I think that's sort of an important kind of point to remain. I think the ability to sort of dictate outcomes is going to be limited. And it's limited not only because of U.S. policy choices and U.S. kind of, let's say, policy kind of the outcome of various policies that have been taken up until now by previous administrations, and of course what we see right now by this administration. I think there is also sort of a structural element to it as well. Whether you call it apolarity, whether you call it multipolarity, whether you call it sort of the growing role of regional actors, the kind of the regional empowerment that we essentially see. I think that is also another contributing factor to why we see this sort of let's say diminishing U.S. control. And I think the outcome is that you have kind of a region where you don't necessarily need real alignment to kind of create partnership and to create engagement, and you have those let's say former alignments essentially increasingly being supplanted by deals and transactionalisms. I've talked about this in the context of North Africa, but I think it applies across the region, and that's why it's important to look at the outcome, to look at the limitations and the outcome of a purely transactional approach. So I would argue that this is essentially what Mr. Trump is contributing, President Trump is contributing, which is that we have purely transactional approaches. Those have their strengths, but of course they have also their drawbacks. They're unpredictable. They lack a strategic vision. They lack a durable framework. And then of course they lack an institutionalized approach.
Thank you very much. So if I understand well what you've just said, the US may keep reacting to changes instead of leading them, and maybe, and this is a question I wanted to ask to you, Bader, maybe there is an exception, which could be the normalization of ties between Israel and Saudi Arabia. We know that Washington is pushing for this normalization. We also know some experts posit that normalization could be used somehow to lead to regional de-escalation. Trump, I think, in an interview for the Times Magazine a month ago, said that Saudi Arabia would normalize ties with Israel before the end of the year. Let's see if this happens or not. Do you think that this holds true? I mean, this is a bit risky for you, and if so, what, according to you, could hinder or accelerate such a normalization? Taking a take on Trump's statements is always very risky. Feel free to reject my question and focus on...
I'll take it with an open arm. I have no issues with it. But before I go to this very direct question, let me give a quick comment on Iran and then the US, based on the discussion, and then I'll move into the Saudi-Israel issue.
Please do.
Look, as you were talking about who's more dangerous for the region, Iran or Israel, especially if we're looking at those countries that are between Iran and Israel, namely the Gulf states. And there has been a variant threat perception. Sometimes it's Iran, sometimes it's Israel. Like any normal acting state, they'll look at their national interests and they'll see what the other actors are doing at any given time. I think where we stand today, there has been some, disagreements on which one comes before the other. But I think if you look at the wider space in the last few years, there has been a convergence over Israel being the bigger threat. And accordingly, there has been more Gulf coordination to combat that threat. Various tools at their disposal. But when we come to Iran, and this is an open question, Iran has been certainly weakened in the last 2 years. It's been hardly hit. But the open question is, it's weakened, but has it become inherently weak? And this is a question yet to be answered in the coming months based on what happens. So the variables are quite open on that open question. But I think with Iran, the problem that we have in the region when it comes to Western treatment of Iran, it becomes quite laser focused on the nuclear issue. And I think to have a sustainable, integrated Iran, because look, Iran is our neighbor. We want well for Iran. I mean, we want well for everyone in the region, because only when there is clear win-win for everyone does the region thrive and prosper. And for Iran to resolve this issue, it's not only about the nuclear weapons. We need to also tackle its missiles. We also need to tackle its very problematic regional behavior, whether through its meddling in internal affairs across the Arab states in ways that, frankly, the Arab states have not done in Iran. So these files need to come in together. Iran has been quite reluctant in addressing all these files. They want to rehash and revive a format of the JCPOA, but 2025 is not 2015. So I think that's where we need to move forward on Iran. With the US, I wrote a piece, I remember, upon the election of Mr. Trump a year ago, last November, for Chatham House. And based on the election dynamics and the people around him, I was saying that he will need to balance between the isolationist tendency in his administration and the interventionist tendency. Now, a year forward, after we've seen a record, I think I haven't seen any isolation.
It's not even a year yet. This is the funny thing.
It's not even a year, but so much has happened in these 10 months. But I think what we see is an America, through the very personalized vision of Mr. Trump and his close associates, that wants to remake America's position in the world. This is a country under this administration that does not isolate itself. And let me take you back to the trade issue. This whole tariff issue is not only for media and show. They clearly see themselves losing power, and they want to go back to that heyday of Pax Americana that they're not in at the moment. So I think that's part of that dynamic. And when he visited the Gulf for the second time, it was his first visit, we were surprised by the semblance of a strategy or a worldview in which for the first time, a US president comes and tells us, we've done it wrong, regime change is wrong, we have our own value system, you have your own, we're not going to interfere with one another. And it's interesting to see how that pans out, because I think with it is also the victorious impulse that he would like to seize. Yeah. So with the Israel-Iran issue, when he saw Israel moving forward in a fast-paced manner, he moved in, and he claimed it. If it were the other way around, he wouldn't claim it as much, and hence the quick call to the ceasefire when he saw things not moving around, especially after the attack on Doha, because that hit all the standards, as Intissar has mentioned.
But is that, but is that a strategy or a lack of a strategy?
Look, if
An abandonment of the old strategy?
To me, transactionalism brings with it a set of values that may not have been put into a doctrine or into a document, but it speaks to a predictable way of moving things. And that in itself is a value system, I think. It's an unconventional way of presenting that value system. But to me, for example, when the Biden administration came out with foreign policy for the middle class, I'm like, well, what's that about? And I ask US officials at the time, and they grapple with an answer. So sometimes it's seizing on the opportunities and moving backwards. It's an open question, no doubt. But the interesting part for me is, post-Trump, how is the Republican Party going to reinvent itself with that kind of style? And that would be the question that we should take forward when looking at the US. So this was a long-winded detour to your question.
But before you answer, do you have something to say on that or not?
No, I think we'll talk more about this tomorrow, so I don't want to take time from Q&A.
I think we're on the same page, by the way.
No, I mean, certainly. But I think, to me, yes, I mean, you can work backwards and say, here is the means, and then I will kind of retrofit a policy to it. It works, and maybe it doesn't work. It's a very narrow sort of approach. And then it becomes very difficult to sort of figure out what is it that you are trying to retrofit. Because you can go to the Gulf and say, we've done it all wrong, and we should not have meddled in your affairs, and so on and so forth. That's a worldview. What does that mean in terms of the US strategy? Does that mean that the US is no longer going to dictate world order? Does that mean that the US no longer wants to be a power? Because then that's at odds with some of the action that the US is still pursuing. So there's quite a bit of chaos in this. Yes, transactionalism comes with a set of values, implicit values, but none of those to me represent any kind of coherent strategy, and certainly any kind of perception of the role of the US in the way that we have kind of conventionally known it. Maybe there is a rethinking. Maybe there's something sort of kind of bigger, sort of I don't know, percolating. But what I see is that when you come to the table and talk about transactionalism, you try to give yourself all of the benefits without any of the commitments. But in that process, you also relinquish a great deal of influence. You're essentially moving away from saying, we're all going to sit down and negotiate these issues within a framework that I, as a hegemon, created and invented. And your actions are going to be not only dependent on what happens with, this particular construction deal, they're going to impact the broader relationship. Transactionalism removes all of that off the table. And it's essentially you and me on equal footing. You do A and I do B, and that's it. And I think, to me, that I see that as sort of stripping away influence, strategy, and so on and so forth, in the way that we have always thought about world order, and particularly the US's role in it.
Look, strategy as a concept is also up to debate. I mean, he doesn't claim that he went into the Project 25 platform, but that certainly, a lot of it is echoed into his actions in this first year, or the first 10 months. Another thing is, we have a set of actions that put America first. So to him, this is the white banner, and anything that can fit into that banner becomes a convenient strategy. Now, this challenge for the US today is domestic on the one end, because they're battling different value systems as we speak. I mean, look, we're talking, it's the third week of November. They just had an election in the US, and the Democrats won big. I mean, and arguably not even the Democrats. I mean, Momdani was castigated by the conventional Democrats. So there is a shuffling of values as we speak. But I think he's trying to show that whatever that he does puts America first, and that's how other countries have been trying to remake themselves as well. We've been hearing these languages across the board. India first, Saudi first, so echoes of it have percolated into other spaces beyond the US, speaking to the influence of the US even if it doesn't want to exercise that influence. But very exciting topic, let me tell you. I mean, there is more to be said there. But let's go back to normalization. And let me cast a wider net on the issue of normalization, because sometimes it gets into the very specific Saudi-Israel one, which I'll come to. But look, the region has had enough with wars and with conflicts and with disputes. And that's why many elements in the Middle East have sought this normalization track. Now, we're talking about Turkey normalizing with various Arab states. We're talking about Saudi Arabia normalizing with Iran. And we're obviously talking about the UAE and Bahrain normalizing with Israel. That doesn't mean that the Gulf states are on that same track. There has been a spectrum of views on how to deal with Israel. So you found 2 countries of the 6 that have assumed formal diplomatic relations. You have 2 countries in between, if we're looking at the spectrum, namely Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who are discussing things probably in an informal manner. Qatar is a mediator, so they have to have these discussions with the Israelis even before the war, because they hosted Hamas at the request of both the US and Israel. And obviously the prelude to the talks between the Saudis, the Israelis, and the Americans. And then on the farther end of the spectrum, you have Kuwait and Oman, who are staunch anti-normalizers. This, in a nutshell, is how the Gulf Cooperation Council works. It preserves the national identity of each country and its interest, but at pursuing common goals. And the 6 countries agree on one common goal. There has to be an end to the Israeli occupation of Palestine. There needs to be a 2-state solution, and there is no doubt to that. Yet they have different routes at achieving that goal. I mean, look, the UAE has normalized in 2020. And if you look at the record today, for example, the UAE was able to provide humanitarian aid the most because of that relationship with Israel. So they used that to the benefit of the community in place. Now, going into Saudi-Israel, the Saudis have been very clear over and over again. And I've heard it firsthand. I've written a piece on it. You guys can Google it. It's called The Saudi Solution. And there will be no normalization if there is no independent Palestinian state. They want to begin from the end game. So instead of doing it gradual from the beginning, like the Oslo process, they want to begin from the end. We declare a Palestinian state. East Jerusalem is the capital. The question of returnees is somewhat addressed, whichever tools that come to it, and then we work backwards into what steps that need to be taken. I heard that interview with Mr. Trump at CBS, 60 Minutes, and the Saudis came out the next day with a Reuters statement saying, we're not going to normalize until there is a 2-state solution. In the Manama dialogue, there was an official from the Saudi Foreign Ministry that said, I mean, she was reading the script, but then she got up without the script. She's like, and I'll say this again and again, we will not normalize until we move forward with the 2-state solution. It's up to the Americans and the Israelis to hear what they want to hear, but they cannot ignore the actual issue. If you don't provide Palestinians with dignity and with the right to live honorably, you're not going to have peace. Simple. It's not going to happen. You can't contain that issue. And containment has been the name of the game, unfortunately. So if they are serious, and we've seen this administration pursue their leverage on the Israelis, I mean, to be fair, twice. The first time was a joint Biden-Trump administration drive at the beginning of Trump's administration, when we had a few weeks of calm. And now we have one. I mean, we call it a ceasefire, but Palestinians are being killed every single day. So we've unfortunately normalized that behavior, and we shouldn't. We should continue speaking about it, we should call it out, and we should find a permanent resolution. It's to the interest of Israelis, before anyone else, to have a 2-state solution. Because with that, they have the promise of integration, they have the promise of actual peace and prosperity. You can't be living in peace when you're fighting different fronts. Israel bombed 7 countries this year. It can't continue along those lines. And America should push for outcome as Intissar is saying, when using that leverage to ensure that its interests are met. And to be frank, the members of the US Congress have openly been speaking about America first in the sense of calling out the genocide. The word genocide has popped up among certain members that you wouldn't expect them to say it. So that terrain should also be noticed and should be supported.
Thank you so much. So you are telling us that no normalization would take place anytime soon?
Not in next week's visit.
Very unlikely, let's say.
It's highly unlikely. We have a Saudi official visiting next week, and this is not gonna happen.
So just Fatima.
I just want to say something about the Abraham Accord. Actually, it seems for me strange because we forget something very important in these Abraham Accords. The Arab street, the people, we deal with the government, with the leaders, with the decision maker. And how about the street? How we can make happen this agreement? For me, it doesn't make sense. Because if we go to the field and you ask people, you travel in all the region, you cannot hear this go into success, even before the October 7. So I think this is for me is an actor. The population, this population base, is an actor, and they are powerful, all together. They can, these leaders, these regimes, the government, the people can change for them a lot of situations. They have power, is what I'm trying to say. Mm-hmm. We cannot ignore them. And what they feed them? They feed them the narrative. Now we are not just on war using weapons, missiles, and drones. We have another war of the perception, war of media, social media. So the thing is that it seems for me that we are ignoring this base, this population, the voice of these people. So we should take it in consideration. We deal with state to state. Yes, we do agreement. Okay, we do this, we do business. And, it's like, ignoring a big population, that they have their, they are strong altogether.
If you are under an authoritarian setting, it makes sense somehow because the leaders are unaccountable. I'm not saying this is fair, but for instance, if you look at Egypt, the protests, pro-Palestine protests are banned. You go to jail. In Morocco, the leader of the BDS movement was found unconscious at his home because he was opposing normalization.
But there is things happening, They
I
cannot
agree.
control everything.
I agree
I'm sorry. We can plan a lot of things. We can make a lot of scenarios. We can think about, but never, we cannot control everything.
Thank you so much. So now I think we have about 15 minutes to open this discussion to our audience. So please do not hesitate to ask your question. You can ask it in English, Castellano, Catalan. I can translate if needed. Please introduce yourself before asking the question.
Thank you for your time. Ramon here from Barcelona, just curious CIDOB member. My question is for Bader. You were mentioning the Saudi Arabia not going to, on the Gulf states, not normalizing the relations until the two-state solutions are effective. My question is, what actual levers do the Gulf states have on Israel and the US? Now, we've seen that Israel has been acting the last decades, moving steadily, occupying the West Bank. So what actual levers do the Gulf states have to shape an outcome, right, and actually make the two-state solution real?
If you agree, we can maybe take three more questions and group them so that so there were other hands that were raised.
Hi, good evening. My name is Saad Bourgeois, and sort of to stay on this same topic of the two-state solution, it's interesting because I think once again we find ourselves having the same conversation, but in many ways, I'm just wondering if those are buzzwords that don't have any practical, outcome, at least for now. And what we're thinking about the role that perhaps the Gulf states have to play, there are two main actors, which are Israel and Palestinians. And there are a lot of things that need to happen domestically in those two countries or those two constituencies for that process to move forward. And then you also have the role of the United States, and can go back to the discourse that happened on stage about how we see the role of the United States, but I do believe that the United States is probably the most critical actor in trying to push for the two-state solution. I think I'm wondering if, what kind of leverage the U.S. can use to make that happen on both sides, but also with other regional actors.
Thank you very much for your question. Maybe we can take 2 more questions, if you agree.
Hello, my name is Albert. In this case, what I wanted to ask a question regarding what you were talking about, how Israel is becoming more and more independent from the United States, how the United States is not controlling the actions of Israel. So in this case, I wanted to make this question is, till what point making Israel this much independent on what the US can control will benefit the US? Till what point the US will go to a moment that they're going to start constraining the capacities of Israel in order to not make Israel go further into disordering the region. Thank you.
Thank you, and we will take maybe 1 more question, and then we will go for another round of question, hopefully.
Hi, thank you very much for your discussion so far, really interesting. My question is, given what you've been talking about the US basically not being able to restrain Israel in the region and kind of failing at governance, as you've put it, and failing kind of strategically to contain these conflicts, and at some points even provoking Iran, you could say. Do you ever see a scenario where the Gulf states might actually start to call for a withdrawal or more of a reduced US presence in the region if the kind of strategic utility of that is not so clear anymore, especially given the kind of attacks that we saw in Doha? And I mean, even with the Biden administration, there were a lot of issues with the kind of defense guarantees, a lot of doubts about that. So I'd be really interested if longer term you kind of see maybe the Gulf states seeing the US as kind of more of a problem and a destabilizing force in the region than they do now.
Thank you. We will start with this first round of questions, if you agree. Who wants to start answering?
I have just a couple of points. I think most of these questions are really for you, but they're about the role of the role of and leverage, I guess, available to Gulf states. I think it was the point about the two-state solutions. I agree. I mean, I don't really have an answer. I agree. I think there is a huge disconnect between the way that we talk about an ultimate solution for the Palestinian problem, for the Palestinian question, which is globally a two-state solution, and between the reality in Israel. The reality in Israel is that there is no consideration for a two-state solution, and a one-state solution is a non-starter. So this is the reality. And it's a reality that it's de facto. I don't want to give short shift to some of the people inside Israel that still maybe support the idea, but I would argue they're probably a minority, and if they're not a minority, they're a silent majority. But if you hear what the right wing says, what Mr. Netanyahu's coalition says, there really is no future for Palestinians in Israel. And this is what makes it a very, very difficult conversation you have, because the perception of a solution is in one end. US, UN, EU, Arab partners, everybody sees that as being the ultimate solution, maybe a small number of Israelis. And then you have the reality, which is completely different. And we're not really anywhere near trying to kind of figure out how to bring those two things together. So that. If I may, Bader, I'm just going to encroach on your territory a little bit. I think someone asked about what leverage do Gulf states have towards Israel. I mean, I think you asked and answered the question. I think the leverage is normalization, maybe potentially is maybe the biggest piece of leverage, at least in my perception, I would say. But again, here I'm encroaching on your territory. In terms of Israel, is there a future in which you can see the U.S. trying to, or let me kind of back up a little bit. The idea that sort of Israel is kind of, breaking away on its own and doing whatever it wants. I mean, this has been a structural, in a way it's a structural issue, and it's also in a way an oversimplification, because, this sort of the relationship between the U.S. and Israel has been, kind of evolving, that, who's the bigger, who's the more powerful partner, who's the client partner. I mean, this is something that's been changing over the years, but I don't see a future in which this administration certainly doing anything to constrain Israel. I don't see it. I think, that there is also, when I was talking about sort of an oversimplification of kind of the Israel leading and the U.S. following, I think there is also a way in which the vision of the region that the Israeli right-wing advances very much fits with the vision of the region that you see in many circles in the U.S. And in that sense, there's sort of an interesting kind of confluence of events. But I don't see this administration doing anything to constrain Israel. And I think it's going to be very, very difficult even for other, future administrations, other actors, etc., to begin to kind of tackle this issue. There might have been moments, I don't know, we could argue there might have been moments in history in which that could have happened, etc. In terms of the U.S. being viewed as, let's say a weaker, maybe sort of spoiler, let's say, actor in the region, I don't know. I still think, as I started my sort of points, I still kind of say there's U.S. dominance in a number of different kind of areas, and I think that's sort of well understood, etc. But we do see some hedging, and we do see some, let's call it maybe diversification of partnerships that has been happening for many years. I think Gulf partners work with, and it's not just Gulf partners. They work with China, they work with others, and you will notice that increasingly the U.S. has a very hard time sort of saying to anyone really, you can only work with us and you are precluded from working with other actors. That is not on the table anymore. And again, I think that speaks to the point about control and sort of dictating the outcomes that I've been talking about. But maybe my view on this is too narrow, and I'm kind of too married to my own, let's say, framing on this, but that's certainly my perception.
Should I?
Please do.
Okay. Many questions, but let me start with where Intissar ended on the two-state solution, whether it's a buzzword or not. Look, it's hard to imagine a space in which we find the ultimate ideal moment in which, you imagine fast forward, Palestine exists as a contiguous state, and they have normal relations, they're treated with respect, and they're seen, like everyone else, because they are, everyone is normal. They want to live a good life, they want job security, they don't want to be bombed every single day and killed. So this is the normal for everyone. To claim otherwise is different. And, when you're under occupation, it takes you to other spaces in which you want to protest this occupation. If you talk to negotiators on the ground, both Palestinian and Israelis have been dealing with this question for a long time. And Intissar laid out either the two-state or the one-state. There has been also the confederacy idea in which, and it's innovative, in which, okay, you're not ready for the two-state solution. How can we have a confederacy in which we have joint citizenships, we have land swaps, we have legal residencies, so that wouldn't dismantle all of the settlement structure. And I've spoken with Palestinian negotiators that feel that this can happen if there is the will from the other side, which doesn't.
Don't Israelis view that as like a euphemism for one state?
They're not going to accept the one-state solution because the majority would be Palestinian, which would then upend the rationale of the Israeli state. And that's why they added the Jewishness in the last 15 years. This wasn't there before, speaking to their shift to the right as well. But look, globally, there hasn't been what we've been doing in the last year. The EU, along with Norway and the Saudis, Saudi Arabia, have launched in September 2024 the Global Alliance for the Implementation of the Two-State Solution. These are not naive policymakers. They know that this is not the time for the two-state solution, given all the killings. But I think as a sign of leadership, the power of imagination has to remain there. And we need to think that there is that light at the end of the tunnel. And in this year, we've seen monthly meetings among these different states, each state committing to what they can do to make that two-state reality come across. And you can go through the records, many documents and papers. Some are actually being worked on right now. The French, for example, are supporting the Palestinians with how can they revamp the constitution. The Egyptians, the Jordanians are working on reforming the local police force. The French and the Saudis co-sponsored a conference at the UN last June with the New York Declaration, very detailed document that once the political will is there from two countries, the US and Israel, we're ready to roll. There's a whole detailed program that everyone is buying into. And that's what we need to keep pushing for. Now, the tricky thing with the Trump administration, they don't commit to the two-state solution. If you push them, they'll say, we'll take whatever that the parties agree to, two-state, one-state. But listen to this. Everything that the Trump administration has been doing, short of saying that they endorse the two-state solution, has been de facto two-state solution. They tell Israel, you're not going to annex the West Bank. They tell Israel, you're going to leave Gaza. They tell Israel, you're not going to kick out Palestinians. They're going to remain in their land if they want to remain. So all of these elements to us in the Arab region are a two-state solution. They're just not ready to voice it probably. And I think if we were to bet on someone being unconventional and quirky as Mr. Trump is, that push can come under his mantle to claim that he delivered the peace, which to your point, I mean, someone mentioned that the two parties are not there. I mean, Sharm el-Sheikh was quite interesting for me in the optics. We're signing a ceasefire agreement. Who are the warring parties? Israel and the Palestinians, they're not there. So, you know, we have a lot of work to do to give agency to where it's due and to move in that file. But let's not lose hope. I think this is what we have, and we need to support this. I think the drive of recognitions that happened this year is unprecedented. You guys started this, Spain, Slovenia, Belgium, Ireland, and then the next wave was last summer. Canada, UK, Australia, France. Who would have thought? The country that offered the Balfour Declaration is now recognizing Palestine. So we've gone a long way. And I think we need to keep that into context. Now, going into the Gulf states, I invite you to read my last piece. I published it a month and a half ago. The title was, what should the Gulf do after the Qatar attack? And I think they have a lot of leverage that's unfortunately not being exercised as much as I'd like it to be. And let me give you a list of issues that I mentioned in this piece. So first of all, they can have flyover bans. Israel is surrounded by Arab states. Saudi Arabia and other countries opened up that space at the request of the Trump administration, Trump 1.0, with the 2020 normalizations that happened. Imagine the life of an average Israeli citizen who will need to travel around the globe to make a move. That adds local pressure inside Israel. And then that pushes the government to change its behavior. So that's one example. The second one is sanctions. Those have been tried. You know, South Africa speaks with a very clear model, and I know that the EU has been talking about that for a very long time. I hope that they can push that file forward, and I think the more that you can get countries to sanction different elements to change behavior, that's a very civil way instead of the bombings that Israelis have been putting on us in the region. A third thing that the Gulf states can do is exercise their economic might with their sovereign wealth funds. We're talking about the biggest economic powerhouses in the world. If they come together and they also divest from Israeli companies or from companies that do business with Israel, I think those companies mean business. They're going to deal with us. They're not going to deal with Israel. Right? And fourthly, the whole defense component, which ties to the next question. The Gulf has already started diversifying. I mean, let me walk you back to why the US is there. Iraq invaded my country, Kuwait, in 1990. US presence prior to that was barely minimal. There wasn't much. And it only increased after 1991. And it continues to be there to supposedly give protection to those small states. Now, if these small states are being hit because of the US bases there, they become a liability, and I'm thinking of the Doha attack. So that's where the rethink has been moving. If you remember, the Saudis signed a defense pact with Pakistan, a nuclear power. This is something that shows that we are now moving towards other elements. In the last 3 years, there has been a very active local defense mechanism capability within the Gulf, namely in the UAE, followed by Saudi Arabia. They want to produce locally. And I think, look, if we have so much to castigate Iran with, they're an industrial country. Lower quality, lower level, yes, but they're industrial. And I think that's where we need to go in the Gulf region to then exercise more agency. And the US will pick that up because they would not want to see some of that shifting. So I think there is a lot of room to move things forward. And you know, is Israel independent of the US, if I can encroach on your territory as well? If the US stops its annual aid to Israel and its fueling of much of its tax, some of its tax money into those defense deals with Israel, I think you'll see a very changed Israeli behavior. It was rumored that the 12-day war was a 12-day war because America would not continue supporting Israel with the air defenses because Iran surprised all of us with the capabilities that were being pushed, and they did attack Israel. I mean, there was a whole secrecy at some of these elements, but Israel was hit. The Iron Dome didn't do it for them. So this is the things to watch in the next round. We do not wish blood and agony and suffering for anyone. Anyone. I think we need to move forward. We have a young population that wants to live in normalcy, and we don't need to live with this kind of conflict. This is taking too much of our time and energy, and we need to put it into the right direction, and I hope sane minds can take us there. Thank you.
Thank you, Bader. Unfortunately, I would love to take more questions unless there is one very urgent question, which we could take because we are in Barcelona. We never start on time, and we never finish on time either. So if not, thank you very much. I wanted to add to our audience here that our guest came from Paris, from Kuwait, from Washington, from London. We have Yossi with us, Samuele here, and some other, because we have a closed-door seminar tomorrow. They will be authoring very fascinating chapters answering to this question, and a CIDOB report, which is coordinated by Samuel Abrami, who is here, and myself, will be published in early 2026. So again, please join me in thanking the speakers for bringing these amazing insights, and thank you to all of you for being part of the discussion today. So stay tuned. Thank you very much.